Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us here at Microsoft Research for a fabulous faculty summit. I hope you're having as much fun as I am. My name is Dana Boyd, and I'm a senior researcher here at MSR. And I've been doing a lot of work sort of in the socio-technical spaces. And the conversation for today is actually a project that Rain and I kickstarted, I guess, about a year ago with the Digital Crimes Unit, where we wanted to try to understand what was known or unknown about the issues of human trafficking. And in part because we're really interested in the possibilities that computer science and technology have to actually help address some of the puzzles that we've been dealing with. And what sort of came out of this project is that we put together and we funded 6 different research projects to try to really analyze what was happening in the space of human trafficking, and in particular one subsection of it, the commercial sexual exploitation of minors, primarily using the internet technologies. What we have today for you is actually 4 different speakers who are going to talk about different parts of their research, different parts of their approach to understanding this sort of challenging issue, with the hope of actually enticing those who are more computationally minded in the room to work with us to start to address the puzzle. So before I sort of begin, here's sort of basics of the agenda for today. And I want to sort of briefly introduce, we've got 4 speakers with us today. They'll be up here one at a time giving a presentation, and then we'll get into more of a general panel. The first presenter after me will be Janice Woloch, who is a senior researcher at the Crimes Against Children Research Center at the University of New Hampshire. The next speaker will be Mary Leary, who is an associate professor of law at Catholic University of America. The third and fourth presenters are kind of together, I think. But first will be Ed Hovey, who directs the Human Language Technology Group at the Information Sciences Institute, ISI, at the University of Southern California, USC. It's like a long sling of acronyms. And then our final presenter will be Mark Latinero, who's the research director at the Annenberg Center on Communication, Leadership, and Policy. And what you'll hear is that these are 4 very different disciplinary backgrounds to addressing this sort of challenge. So, okay. Pretty slides, I haven't quite figured out how they work. So before we begin, I want to give you sort of a sense of how we've been thinking about the project at Microsoft Research, and sort of lay out some of the big challenges before we get into the conversations with each presenter, and then opening up to a panel and discussion. So the first sort of way of thinking about it is the goal of this has been to look at a complex system problem, sometimes referred to as child sex trafficking. Many of us, and you will hear a lot of different contested terms in how we talk about this. I tend to refer to it in the language of the commercial sexual exploitation of minors. We're talking about young people under the age of 18 who are in many ways bought and sold for sex, and the processes around this can be very complex. We can talk about young people in the United States who, for various reasons, have run away and encountered somebody who decides to actually sell them on the streets. We talk about young people outside of the country who may think that they've come to America for a better life, and end up being sold. There's a lot of different complexities to this issue. And the speakers today will go through some of it. The challenge with it is that as we started to look into it, we started to realize that technology started to being used in this process. And this all blew up probably about 2 years ago. It started when there was concerns over how Craigslist, a very well-known consumer technology, was being used, or the questions was how was it being used to encourage or enable different kinds of trafficking. And I should note that when we talk about trafficking, there is generally also thoughts about labor trafficking as well as sex trafficking that is adults. For this particular project, we decided to look specifically at the kinds of trafficking that were occurring, of trafficking of minors, of children, for sexual purposes. When sort of questions about Craigslist emerged, the conversation in the public eye was that technology was making everything about the commercial sexual exploitation of minors so much worse. And this raised a lot of big question marks, because the fact is that we actually know very little about what goes on in this space. Certainly, there's been a lot of qualitative work with young people who have been exploited, stories that have come out during cases of arrests, things where we start to actually hear the stories of young people. But we don't actually even know the frequencies. There are a lot of estimates that get thrown around. We don't know how frequently this occurs. We don't know actually how much worse things are because of technology, or if it's better. This has become a really messy space, and part of it was to try to understand this. What we've seen is that the major sites that allow people to connect, any site that allows people to connect for good or positive interactions, also enables various forms of illicit interactions, including different forms of organized crime, including different things that we will talk about as child sex trafficking. One of the things that I've been sort of dealing with in my own head is that more than anything, what the technology has done is made this whole process more visible. If you go to various neighborhoods in Seattle tonight, you can actually find that there are young people sold on the streets in this town. If you go to certain neighborhoods all across the country, you can find this process going on. But most of you will never encounter it unless you're looking for it. And that is something that we generally think of as a positive nature. The fact is, technology makes it far more visible. The technology allows us to see different kinds of illicit activities and different kinds of problematic activities. And this makes people panic in many ways. They don't want to see it, and we don't want it to be happening. Well, historically, when it comes to this issue, what we've seen is the arrest of young people as the sort of solution. And in many states in this country, young people are arrested for child prostitution as a way to get them off the streets, as a way to actually try to make the process more invisible. Well, what happens with technology is that what we have is a shift in what is actually visible. Historically, it was the young people that were visible on the streets. It was very hard to see the people who were buying the young people, let alone the people who were selling them or trafficking them. With technology, we actually get traces, and that trace data raises new challenges for us. What happens that we can see the people who actually put up the advertisements? What happens that we can see the people who have actually made a deal and brokered the deal? And this raises a question of how do we actually leverage that kind of visibility? Can we actually make a difference with it? And in some ways, that was a lot of the frame for how we thought about this project and one of the excitements for us. Now, what we started to also realize is that when we talk about this whole process, we talk about a whole slew of different things. And here you will see 15 different sort of issues that we've realized that have technology to be a part of it, right? And so most of the focus, this doesn't actually have a pointer, most of the focus tends to actually be on the process of advertising and selling of children, or the processes of searching for them by people who are looking to purchase them, or the ways in which the money exchange occurs. But these are all different processes which those of you who are really technical could imagine the ways of actually investigating what's happening in this domain, which is part of the excitement and part of where I'm hoping that you'll get curious to learn more. Before we go into the actual sort of more substantive talks of my colleagues here, I just want to say that the reason we're excited to be presenting these work and these challenges to you here at Microsoft Research is that we actually think that there's an opportunity to leverage that visibility to make a difference. We've started to see people using data mining techniques to identify content that is likely to be trafficked content. Keep in mind that trafficked content isn't always as visible as one might think. We're talking about the sales of overpriced teddy bears on online services. We're talking about things that look like they may be legal or reasonable, but end up not being so. There's also some interesting challenges in terms of search technologies. What does it mean to be able to identify the search terms that people are looking for? What does it mean to start to identify different kinds of data that pops out in terms of, for example, large money activities? Can we start to see odd patterns? Right? These are some of the data mining techniques. The other things that you will hear about are different possibilities of vision techniques. Can we actually see images that are likely to be problematic? For those of you who are not familiar with the Digital Crimes Unit at Microsoft Research, it's a pretty phenomenal program. And one of the things that they did years ago was work with a group of researchers to develop something called photo-DNA. And what photo-DNA is it's a very simple technology that disrupts a process at large. And so what they recognize is that in the space of child pornography, what we know is that there are certain images that are used more frequently and traded more frequently than others. These are images that are known to be photographic depictions of a crime against a child child. When you're talking about pictures where you're talking clearly a minor, you're talking about a picture that is clearly a rape of a child. And one of the things about these pictures as well is that they tend to be circulated, and they tend to be circulated widely. So Photo-TNA took the most egregious photos. Some of these photos were not only did they know that this was a picture of a crime against a child, but they've identified the child. And they look for all images coming in on major services. So for example, on SkyDrive and Hotmail and Facebook, all of these services look and say, what is the likelihood that this image is actually a copy or a modification of a known image? It's a very simple hashing technology. It's a very simple vision tool. And yet it's extremely powerful in being a disruption to this. So when we actually see one of these images, the entire account gets shut down and it gets sent to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. It's a phenomenal way of disrupting a process. And one of the things that's so positive about it is that it actually doesn't invade any privacy issues, and it actually makes certain that we are dealing with known images. There have been 0 false positives to date. So the question for us, and as we look to some of the work that you're going to see today, is what can we imagine as other small little interventions, technologies that may not be crazy, intense, or hard to build, but where we understand the puzzle and we understand what's going on in this space in order to develop technologies that can do us amazingly good things to actually change the entire domain. So with that in mind, I'm going to ask Janice to join us and share a little bit more about her work.
Thank you, Dana, and thank you for organizing this. At the Crimes Against Children Research Center, we have been researching the impact of technology on sexual crimes against children for more than a decade. We have conducted large national surveys of young people about their experiences on the internet. We've conducted several surveys of large national samples of law enforcement about the characteristics and dynamics of sex crimes against children and the impact of technology on those sorts of crimes. Also, I am working with two lovely young computer technology people at the University of Massachusetts on a project that looks at child pornography trading in peer-to-peer file sharing programs. So through that, I have got a glimmer, just a glimmer, of machine learning techniques. That's not at all what we do. We do actually, one of my colleagues there called what I do classical frequentistic statistics, I believe is what he said. But we tend to think that our work is actually quite sophisticated in the low-level work, in the low-level circles we move in. By the way, our work is very quantitative. Most of our data is collected through telephone interviews. We use computer-assisted programming technologies, so the telephone interviews are quite complex. I use the term prostitution in this presentation. It is a somewhat controversial term. It's not quite PC to be using this now, but I think that sex trafficking is a somewhat confusing term. The definitions aren't clear. As a researcher, I feel very strongly we need to have clear definitions of things. I think we all know what we're talking about when we talk about young people being prostituted. Most of the victims in these cases are adolescents. Most of these victimizations and most of what these kids suffer a brutality that you rarely see actually in sex crimes against children. Dana asked us, how does technology complicate the issue? I'm drawing from all of our research over the past decade to say that I don't think technology really does complicate the issue. I do think people make assumptions about technology that complicate the issue. And a lot of these assumptions, the three main ones I've listed up here, technology has changed the nature of how minors are prostituted, exploiters who use technology are more dangerous, more children are being prostituted. I see these as hypotheses that are largely unsupported by the research that we have done. And let me explain further. Networked technologies have not changed the nature of prostitution. Social networking is a fact of prostitution and has been ever since it began. I guess I'm going to be blunt and say we're talking about buying and selling young people for sex. That is an activity that has always involved groups of people in recruiting children, in advertising them, in selling them, in keeping them in line, in buying them, in hiding activities from police. So social networks, whether or not facilitated by technology, have always been a large part of prostitution of young people. Also, I would say that most pimps and other exploiters are not sophisticated in how they use technology. Using social networking sites, using cell phones, using online advertising is not advanced technological behavior. Over the past years, millions of people are using technology for all sorts of reasons. These are very common technologies. Most of us, millions of people, are using online advertising to buy and sell all sorts of things, are using the internet for financial transactions, are using the internet to form groups, to recruit members into groups, to make those groups private. This is what we are doing as a society, not and what the criminal elements are doing is not different than what most of us are doing. I would say there probably are a small group of offenders who are using more sophisticated technologies, but those people, and when I say more sophisticated, even encryption is uncommon in a lot of these crimes, and that's being used more and more often. But using things like embedded images, encoded language, I doubt that those types of offenders account for very many of these crimes. So in general, they're using the same technologies that the rest of us are using to do very similar things than what the rest of us are doing. Further, the fact that the use of technology is increasing doesn't mean that child victimization is increasing. And in fact, one of the things we do at the Crimes Against Children Research Center is track data from all sorts of sources about child victimization. And since the mid-1990s, child sexual victimization has declined significantly. And we have data from multiple sources that show these types of declines. I'm just showing a couple of slides here. This, of course, every single case of child sexual exploitation is a matter of concern. But we have data from Child Protective Services, from all sorts of criminal data sets, and from people directly in large national victimization surveys that show large declines in sexual abuse since the mid-1990s. And we also have a lot of data about child well-being that shows increases in well-being, particularly the aspects of well-being that would most likely put kids at risk for being exploited by prostitution. For example, fewer kids are running away from home. This is police data, but we have other data that shows this. This is a decline in teen birth rates, but we also show a significant decline in sexual activity among very young teenagers, and that is highly correlated with exploitation. Declines in multiple sex partners among high school, declines in suicidal ideation among young people that suggest mental health among young people is improving. So there are a large number of indicators that suggest that the things that put kids at risk for being exploited by prostitution are actually declining. This does not mean that we should not be concerned. In many cases, we have presented this data to a lot of different audiences, and I look out there and I see skeptical looks. If the data were reversed and we were showing higher rates of victimization and higher rates of problems among youth, people would feel like their assumptions were confirmed. However, what I'm really bringing is a message of optimism. What we think is that decades of work by all sorts of people who have looked at child victimization and been concerned and worked against it have been productive. They've made an impact, and they're going to continue to make an impact. And the very fact that we've reached a point that we are looking at what I think is the most extreme sort of child victimization, prostitution, that leaves huge scars on its victims, that the rate that we're looking at this in a different light now than we did 15 and even 10 years ago shows to me the impact that we're making in this area. Dana asked, how does technology help the issue? Well, what we see in our research is that police are using sophisticated technology in a lot of ways to respond proactively to sexual exploitation crimes. In other words, they're not sitting around anymore waiting for crimes to be reported. They have ways to go out and look, and they're using sophisticated tools to do that. Technology is a gold mine of evidence, and one of the things that we have found is that when you look at cases of child sexual abuse as they make their way through the criminal justice system, whether or not there is electronic evidence makes a huge difference in successful prosecution. Cases with technological evidence have much higher rates of success. And then Dana's final question was to suggest innovation. Well, I am working, as I said, with computer scientists and using machine learning on data that we've gotten from the internet about child pornography. But frankly, I think that a couple of things that probably would be very simple for many of the people in this room to do would be really, really helpful. One is to put technology in the hands of victims and potential victims. The victims in these cases, for many reasons, are often quite attached to the lives that they're leading, painful though they are, and they're very suspicious of authority. They live in a lot of danger. If we could offer them technology and applications that would keep them safe and that would help keep them healthy and that would give them resources so they didn't feel alone out there and so that they could find places to go and find health care and shelter. I think that would be an incredible boon, and I think it would reduce the number of kids who are being victimized because it would give them resources that they need. I also think, and again, this isn't a machine learning sort of or highly technical thing, police are using technology. They see the value of it, they understand it. It can be complicated, though, to integrate technology in police work. One area that I see that's very important is that police do forensic examinations of computers. They're way, way, way backlogged. If that sort of system could be sped up, if forensic evaluations and examinations of computers and cell phones and all of that, if that could be sped up, that would really unblock a huge block in the criminal justice system. And that's it.
Hello, my name is Mary Leary, and I am the opposite of Janice. I don't talk in a nice, pleasant voice. I talk quickly, and I drink a lot of Coke right beforehand. Why did I do that? Thank you. Why did I do that? I did that because I've got 12 minutes to complete the marching orders that Dana Boyd gave me. And I'm going to do the best that I can to do it, and I'm going to ignore the guys in the back when they hold up a sign. No, I'm not, really. Okay, so what are my marching orders? My marching orders were twofold. One is to try to give you a little bit of context for child sex trafficking. I'm in a room which Rain described for me a few weeks ago as the smartest computer science people in the world, and I believe that. So forgive me if I share with you some information that you already know, but since this is outside your discipline, I'm going to try to set the table a little bit for you about what we're talking about to the extent to which we can. And secondly, my marching orders were to put a public policy layer to our dialogue a little bit. So how am I going to do that besides drink a lot of Coke? I'm going to first talk about what we're talking about, and then secondly, a little bit about how we got there, what our development in public policy has been in the last 15 years, and then touch on this intersection of technology and commercial sex trafficking. Sound okay? You're the smartest people in the world, so I know you can keep up with me as I talk like this, right? Okay. I'm going to skip over a lot of slides. Any of you who want some of these slides, I'll highlight for you what are the really good ones that I won't be talking about. Just give me your card and I'm happy to email it to you, okay? What are we talking about? Just to help give it some context, as Dana mentioned, when we talk about child sex trafficking, it's a subset of human trafficking. And the ambassador at large for the Office to Combat Human Trafficking made this statement at my university last year at this time. We see other numbers floated around as well. These are numbers. These numbers change all the time. I'm not advocating for them. I'm just sort of sharing with you what's in the dialogue. But the bottom line is, if you understand when we think about slavery in general, and we think, gosh, that's a 19th century problem, it is not throughout the world. I think we can all agree with that if we can agree on numbers and those sorts of things. So a word a little bit about policy. What do we know about policy? What influences public policy? Sometimes the law leads the way, right? We'll pass, the Congress will pass a statute. Well, that hasn't happened in a long time, has it? But in a functioning Congress, right? Statutes are passed and it might bring along the public, maybe a reluctant public. Sometimes the law leads judges will make rulings that will bring along maybe a reluctant Congress. See Brown versus Board of Education, et cetera. Sometimes the public brings along public policy, right? Either directly through some advocating, see Mothers Against Drunk Driving, right, as an example, or the public brings along public policy by evolution, like technology, having us rethink our concepts of child pornography, our concepts of child sex trafficking. What I would say to you that in this space, sort of all of that is happening. And when we look at public policy, it's kind of happening it's happening not so much that we've changed from state-sanctioned slavery to non-state-sanctioned slavery, but it's happening sort of on the ground level. So I'm going to suggest to you that two sort of threads are going on now which influence our public policy. One is a reconception of victims of child sex trafficking, and two is an explosion of new media. Janice talked about this conception of a victim, so I'll talk about that in a little bit. The year 2000, watershed year throughout the world in our legal understanding of human trafficking. Two events took place. International law, the Palermo Protocol was created. I guess it wasn't really signed, and then in our own domestic law. One thing I want to make clear to you is when we talk about human trafficking, it's a misnomer. There doesn't need to be movement of people to have human trafficking. And so when we talk about child trafficking, I'll give you a couple of definitions of that. So that's where I'm going to skip through human trafficking and get to what you need to know. And under international law, after the year 2000 and the signing of the Palermo Protocol, essentially what you have is this. For child sex trafficking, or as Dana mentioned, commercial sexual exploitation of children or what have you, we're talking about the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of a child for the purpose of exploitation. And in international law, exploitation means other forms of sexual exploitation, including prostitution. And there's no force, fraud, or coercion or anything like that needed if the person is a minor, okay? Year 2000, here in the United States, Trafficking Victims Protection Act, it's been reauthorized more or less every couple of years since then, had a similar provision. And talking about sex trafficking, and I'll get to the important part because I may or may not have seen a sign in the back of the room, child sex trafficking deals with a child engaged in a commercial sex act. What is that? A sex act where anything of value is given or received. And again, here in the United States, there's no movement necessary. There's no force, there's no fraud, there's no Coercion, whoops, sorry, I'm one slide behind. Under federal law, if a child is induced to perform a commercial sex act, that is sex trafficking. Under the federal law. On the state level here in the United States, we've seen a movement, and approximately 47 states have some form of human trafficking laws, but we can fight about if they're good, bad, or indifferent, okay? So that's where we are sort of legally. But I mentioned one of these threads in public policy is exactly that. Do you see the shift here? 15, 20 years ago, we had a real problem, right? If an adult has sex with a child, what is that? Well, that's child sexual abuse and that child's a victim. But interestingly, under the law, if money was exchanged, all of a sudden there was confusion, and that child has now committed a crime. That child is a child prostitute, and we would handle them differently. The law is moving. It is not entirely there, certainly in practice, as Dana mentioned, but it is moving towards trying to reconceptualize the child as a victim of human trafficking. Second thread in our public policy is this explosion of technology. And there is disagreement, as you can tell, between Janice and myself, Janice and others, lots of people about what's this role in technology. And as Dana points out, we're trying to sort of figure it out, if you will. All of these technologies, and you all are the experts here, so I'm going to fly through this just to point out whether we're talking about ownership of technology, what youth are doing with technology, their exposure to media, their content creation, whether we're talking about how they're using these technologies, social networking, what they're doing on social networking. All of these things have possibly increased access to children because with these social technologies, more people have access to each other. Increased the ability of somebody who's trying to market a child as a product to reach more people, increase the ability of a buyer of a product, and I'm not using these words, because I want to, the buyer of a product to find out where can I get this sort of thing. That is happening. So these things are sort of converging, if you will, to today, where people like Dana and Rain are trying to help figure out what is technology doing in this space and how can we use it. And I would suggest we think about how we can use it in the 4 Ps of human trafficking. So the human trafficking people are like, oh, not the 4 Ps again, really. But to help you, how do people think of it? Both the Palermo Protocol and the Trafficking and Victim Protections Act talk about these. And they talk about the notion of prevention, prosecution/investigation, because that would be 4 Ps and an I. Who wants that? So protection and then partnership. So as you are thinking, because you all are so smart and it's going through your head, oh, I could do this and I could do that. If you think about it in that framework, that's kind of helpful. So I don't have much more time. As Dana laid out for you, they've come up with a number of phases of human trafficking. I've taken some economic research as well, or economic commentary, I should say, and added to it. So what the research that I'm doing at the law school is looking at this, what I call 18 phases, and looking and seeing where is technology playing a role here and where can it not. What I'm looking at is simply judicial opinion, okay? So we were supposed to give you our Christmas list of what we wanted, but I'm going to save that for a question and answer, and I'm going to tell you about a couple of cases, okay? To give you, again, I'm just trying to give you a sense of what's going on in this space to some degree. There is a sense out there that, well, I would agree with Janice, the whole notion of networking has always been a part, sure, of prostitution. But I would take the position that technology has sort of changed things. As an anecdotal example, here's here's a newspaper article about this particular defendant who bragged about, I'm the Y2K pimp. This is how easy it is. What did he do? He used MySpace to recruit his victims. He tricked them into a modeling job or that sort of thing. He then used the internet to advertise his product, quote unquote. And then the police came in. They did some electronic work, but they also did some good police work. Ultimately, he pleads guilty, but they used chat logs to convict him, that trail that both Dana and Janice were talking about. And that, I think, is something that we're seeing more and more of. So let me just tell you about one last case to give you a sense of what's going on, and then we'll come back and make fun of the Supreme Court during question and answer. So somebody asked me about that. That's my plug for that. Okay? I want to tell you about a case in Virginia. Wow, that sign is, you should see the words on these signs. Okay, let me tell you about a case about Virginia, and then I swear I'll sit down. Here in Virginia, any of you familiar with Alexandria, Virginia? Right, lovely place, right? You don't think of it, it's not the Vegas of Virginia, right? Okay. Well, in Alexandria was recently a prostitution ring discovered, and I want to tell you a little bit about that based on the affidavit, which is public information. So I don't have all the information, but this is public information. Essentially, the case comes to light when the victim, who's referred to as MW, discloses to her counselor at school that she is being prostituted by her boyfriend. Of course, it's not the phrase that she uses, but the social worker hears that. And so the social worker calls the police, right, and gets them involved. When the police interview, the victim doesn't want to talk to them, doesn't perceive of this situation as one that is exploitive. Okay, but the police do some good work, and one of the things they do is they find advertisements on Craigslist and Backpage, which are confirming the information that they have, even though the victim is unwilling to discuss this with them. Then they get the IP address, and they find there are other ads as well. Then they get, through service, they get the street address of the owner of these accounts. They discover it's paid for by a prepaid credit card. Not to be deterred, they go to the 7-Eleven where the credit card was purchased, and lo and behold, there's videotape. So they take that technology to get, now they've got an image of who purchased this card. The same Backpage ads were connected to a physical address. Then the victim runs away. But they use the cell phone information to find a number of phone calls from the Travelodge in a motel in Alexandria. They go there, and the hotel clerk identifies the victim and this other defendant who they're focusing in on as the people who were there. They get the defendant's credit card paid for the room. Cell phone activity also connects him to another motel. Things go on and on. They finally find the missing and runaway MW. There's somebody there with a co-defendant who she describes as her boyfriend. They go back to social networking where she has identified this particular person as her boyfriend. So right now, it sounds like perhaps a domestic violence IPV situation, which is horrible and bad. But lo and behold, what do they end up discover? Victim number 2, okay? Victim number 2 is recruited. And then victim number 2 recalls, well, at the house where the sort of headquarters here, there was all this technology that was being used to recruit, to advertise, to maintain records and logs. They get that, and what happens with this case? It grows. They end up discovering more victims, an iPod, Facebook accounts, et cetera, et cetera. We end up with 5 defendants, 10 victims, a 5-year-long prostitution ring. Not simply, I should say, child sexual trafficking, but aggravated assault, forced narcotics consumption, armed rape, gang rape, violence threats going on. That's the kind of thing, anecdotally, that we're sort of seeing happening, and that hopefully gives you an illustration of where technology is being used by the offenders, by the purchasers, and where it's being used by law enforcement to help take care of these things. And I am out of time. The lady back there is making a hand gesture I can't even talk about. No, she's not. She's her. Which way? There you go.
Hello, is this on?
It's on the bottom.
Button.
On the bottom.
Hello, my name is Edward Hovey, and I'm the token computer scientist on the panel. So I suppose it sounds like an AA meeting here or something like this. And I just want to say that although Mary has advertised us here collectively as the computer scientists as the smartest people in the world, I tell you, when you're in a project like this, where you deal with so many things outside your experience, you don't feel at all smart. I'll tell you some things that on the technology side are not anything to talk much about, but on the other side, it's really fascinating. I've learned a great deal, not only about the domain, but also about these other fields like sociology and legal affairs and social workers and so on. So I'm working with, I don't know how to put this here, with my colleague, programmer Andrew Philpott. I head the Language Technologies group at ISI, and also with Mark Latonero who's talking next with the Communications School, a School for Communications at USC. And he's the guy who translates geek speak into real language so that people outside can understand what I'm saying. It turns out that many times there is a real serious problem in the real world. And I've discovered this in the past with e-government. I did a lot of work. And now with this problem here, where the technology turns out to be quite simple. And when you say quite simple, you as a technologist say, well, okay, nothing wrong with it, it's a simple problem. But somebody outside, like Mary, sits and says, well, he says my problem is simple, like, what's wrong with him, right? And then you need someone like Mark who can say, no, when he says simple, he means technologically simple. He doesn't mean socially simple or simple to implement in the real world. And in that sense, what I'm going to talk about on the technology side is nothing, you can do this in an afternoon or maybe 2 weeks or 3 weeks. But actually making this work in the real world and actually transferring it in such a way that it has an effect, working with law enforcement and other people, and in such a way that it doesn't offend people like Janice and Mary and Dana, that's not so easy. And that's where I don't feel so smart. And that's where I really enjoy the help of my colleague Mark. So that's the part that I want to get to at the end. And in between, I'm just going to show you what we do, okay? So the problem in particular is you have a bunch of young ladies, most of them underage, or many of them underage, you don't know which they are, organized in some social network run by some person. And they advertise services through a public forum because that's how they find their clients. And the clients there, I used to have a whole bunch of pictures with people named John, like John Lennon and Elton John and John, I don't know, all kinds of Johns. And then Microsoft made me take them down because I didn't own the rights to these photos. So imagine people named Johns there because these are the Johns here. And they then do some interaction with the phone numbers they find on the ads there, and then something happens and money changes hands. And that's the whole picture. That's the particular situation we're looking at. But you can generalize this as there are some people offering goods or services organized in some kind of social network by somebody, whether it's Al-Qaeda or somebody else there. They're offering some kind of services somehow to users who you may or may not be able to identify. Again, there's communication, and then there's, again, some kind of transaction of some kind, and then money changes hands or something changes hands. And the kind of services or goods that can be offered can be information, like national security, like this. It can be prostitution and other services, can be human smuggling, like you're bringing people from Mexico, you've got to find them, or from Thailand or someone. It can be drugs, it can be weapons that you want to make, it can be information how to build bombs. It can be a lot of things. So as a computer scientist, this actually becomes quite an interesting problem. How can you go and find such transactions and infer the user groups and infer the delivery people and their social structure and the whole transaction cycle and things? How can you build technology to make that available in ways that are legal and respect all the privacy issues, in ways that the law enforcement can actually use, and the ways that other social and so on, in this case, people can actually use to help find the right people who they want to save? Now, obviously, the first place you attack is the sort of most public one, which is the provider ads. And it turns out for this problem we're talking about today, but also for some other ones, there are ads on the web, and you can go find these ads, and you can go harvest them and go pull out the data and standardize it and do named entity resolution and entity linking and so on and so forth. And you get nice, clean databases. I'll show you a little example of those things. And then you can find features and do machine learning to find correlations between features, and I'll show you some examples of that, because it's kind of interesting what you can infer or try to infer. Next, you can go and attack the consumers. It turns out that in many problems, the consumers actually have their own social network, and they have their own chat groups and stuff like this. And in this case, you have the John boards, they're so-called, where people talk about, and I show you an example and say, well, I had a great time with this woman, and, you know, where is she now? Or I was in Thailand last week, and man, I had a 13-year-old, and if you go to this town and stuff. I mean, really, that's the kind of stuff you want to get that guy in. I want to get that guy, I'm sorry. Right? It's the kind of thing that it would be nice to just capture the people who are most damaging to others and somehow stop them. Okay? You can also go look for the network of providers, the people who go and produce the services. And then you can try to find patterns in how they operate, when they operate, how they operate in groups, which signs of group behavior, like all kinds of cell phones go dead at the same moment when somebody's arrested, etc. What happens there? When do people swap photos for one another and so forth? And behind them you can find these guys, these organizers, who go and make all this actually happen, because those are the ones you really want to find. No? And then you can find the actual transaction point and what happens there. For instance, Mark and a colleague and I, we were at an FBI sting operation where they actually had 2 rooms, and they found the young women and they brought them in, and as soon as they're underage, whoops, they go to this side, and here's the female police officer, and they take them off. Cell phone gets confiscated, all the numbers get taken up. Very quickly the numbers get called, bring here and so on, before the whole cell phone network goes dead of that set, were thrown into the trash can, and new cell phones are bought and so forth. So that transaction point, if you can find it, is actually a very useful source for information. If it happens to be an operation on a drug house or something, and you pick up all the paper in there and you have this big problem of all the phone numbers and things you want to integrate, it becomes another kind of interesting data collection and standardization, entity linking kind of problem. Now, why? Why do I do this? Because the life expectancy of the young women is 2.5 years. Well, they run away to Hollywood and they want to be an actress, and 2.5 years later they're dead from drugs and violence and stuff. That's a sad thing, no? That you want to stop. The FBI is working on this very hard in various areas around the country, and the federal FBI, and they track people, and they are desperately, desperately in need of decent software. They have stuff where they go to their database, excuse me if you're an FBI guy, but I'm sorry to embarrass you, but they show you the first 25 results from the database, and they cannot see anything else, even though they know there's 250 results that match their search query, simply because that's how it was built in 1962. I mean, really, right? This is something you as a computer scientist can help with not much effort. Our work is to build simple scrapers to get the data, standardize it, put it in databases, update it, make it available, search different parts of the country, serve people law enforcement and other people to use this information, and then to provide data analysis tools on top to do a sort of data analytics kind of thing that is useful also for Homeland Security applications and so on. In fact, this work we're funded by, at the moment, Homeland Security Department, and they're interested in the wider sense of this, the uses of this work. So the initial thing we do is we decode hidden phone numbers, because people type in letters and numbers and all kinds of funny things they think it's going to help. And we try to find links between phone numbers. We try to find when phone numbers move across the country. For instance, all of a sudden, 16 phone numbers who happen to be advertising in Los Angeles are now wherever the NFL, the football game is, or the basketball game is, and 3 days later, they're back. So you know there's something going on with that phone, right? And you find people swapping photos and swapping phone numbers and things. So there's all kinds of evidence of group behavior in this hidden social network of providers, and you can try to find the same on the other side. So you do named entity recognition. We're talking to people to do face detection and record linkage and so forth. And so we build a little system like this, the obvious left to right thing. You go to your sources, you download the posts, you canonicalize them, you put them in databases, you scrape them, you integrate them, and you make a viewer. So we have looked at escort services and John boards, and we've scraped easily tens to hundreds of thousands of individual records. Here's one, for instance, and at the bottom you can see the little record. Here's an example of the time and the age and the location that you get. Here's a John board example where somebody says, does anybody know where this young woman who used to work at Serenity Massage is? And you may be able to find other things about this guy who thinks he's private, but I mean, he's shouting this out to the web, right? And then once you found the obvious raw data, you start correlating among them, and you find trends, and then you do social networks there. So here's the simple things. You just look at phone numbers across different sites, different advertising sites, and you can just see how this person distributed on each day their phone number. So, you know, they advertise on this site or this site or this site. They can see where they move to, where they find more business. You can see when they advertise, when they wake up. Oh, this one tends to wake up at 4 in the afternoon, and this one tends to wake up at 2 in the morning or whatever. You can sort of get patterns of usage and try to correlate that with where they may be living or what other jobs they might be doing. You can look at the ages they report, 46 times 21, 21 times 22. This is obviously somebody who's younger. Somebody who is 18 or 14 is never going to say she's 30, right? She's going to say she's up to that age. Somebody who's 50 is also never going to say she's 16. So you can get a sense of that sort of age. You can see where she says she is by the sort of distribution of locations there. You can look at on daily how active she is, which days she isn't advertising, maybe she's doing something else then, and you can try to find patterns there that may be forensic to help people when they put the legal cases together. You can look at the movements, as I said. You can look at phone numbers that travel in packs, that go to sports places and come back, that go to dead together, numbers that attach to pictures that show other people or strange, just different kinds of people, or that attach reliably to one particular photo. That actually turns out to be a big deal. We're trying to work with agents to know how to automatically recognize which photos are likely to be stock photos and which are likely to be the real photo. Often when you see a person with a camera or a person in a bathroom or a person showing a tattoo or a teddy bear or something, then you know this is probably the real person you're dealing with, and you can do age estimation using certain software age recognition techniques. Then you can apply machine learning to look at correlations between. You can look at characteristics of spelling and language uses. You can look at the bottom the names. If you call yourself Tiffany or Brittany or something, you're not born in the 50s, I'm sorry. If you call yourself Prudence, you might be born in the 50s, but you wouldn't be born in 15 years ago. So there's certain characteristics of things that are one step hidden that you need to think a little bit about, and then you can go look at name lists from the government and find out which names are trend in which areas or which population groups or which ages and so forth. You can look at uses of media, language uses, and so on. And then you, of course, want to avoid false positives, so you can use machine learning techniques to filter out those which are medical discussions or other or political, legal discussions about these things which use a lot of the same words. Simple keyword searching isn't going to work there. So you need to do slightly more sophisticated feature analysis. Here's some numbers on what we've done so far for escort services and John boards. You can see 285,000 posts very quickly. You can collect them. You can do it. Actually, it's easy to collect data set. You can work with this. You have to be aware that when you start harvesting, you don't harvest, you hit from the same machine, the same site, they close you down. So you have to distribute your collections points over 20 or 30 places all over the country, and then you just collect from them. You ping different websites randomly and pull back the information centrally. We're working with the FBI now to try to make this standardized and give them a good service here, and to provide some help to them and through them to people like Dana and everybody else to combat this problem. I just want to wrap up with this final thought here. This may seem like a very, very simple application, and at the moment it is. It's not a big deal to build something like this. However, to use this effectively, not to just build a little thing that you then throw away, but to actually make this used, you need to embed it properly and respectfully in the places, the people who use this, whether it's the FBI or other law enforcement, or whether it's legal services or anybody else, or people using this to do social analysis across the countries, or to do socially based work to try to find where they can access Facebook and something and put ads to say, if you're unhappy, talk to me, don't run away to Hollywood, you're not going to make it in Hollywood, etc. Right? You need to know how to say this sort of thing properly. And to do that as a computer scientist, I can tell you, in my experience, it's not easy to walk in with your arrogance and your computer science terminology and say, I've got a simple problem, here's what I can do for you. It's much better to have someone like Mark who can translate your language into language that is much more acceptable and understandable to potential users of the technology. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ed. So I also have to speak fast because of Dana's time constraints, but I also have to look at notes. I'm going to stand over here. In listening to the other speakers, it's clear that what we have is a unique opportunity for social scientists, computer scientists, legal scholars, and engineers to work on this issue and other important issues of human rights import. But some of you are wondering, how does one even get into this kind of research? Well, what I thought I would do is to take a step back and discuss how I came to be involved and discuss the lessons I've learned through my time working on this issue, and both the opportunities and challenges for social scientists and computer scientists working together on human trafficking, or similar issues at the intersection of technology, human rights, and pro-social change. As a social scientist myself, interested in the social and cultural implications of communication technology, I'm surprised as anyone that I am working daily, delving into the dark issues that pertain to human trafficking, specifically the commercial sexual exploitation of children. Granted, I worked on this issue very briefly 15 years ago, where I spent a small amount of time in the Philippines volunteering with an organization which did social outreach to kids living in the streets of Manila, living in extreme poverty. These children, mostly boys, were involved in what at the time we called child prostitution. Imagine 12-year-old boys living on the streets, exchanging sex for survival, at great risk to themselves. Fast forward to 2010, Alec Ross, a head of innovation at the Department of State, asked us at the Annenberg School and my center to take a look at the intersection of technology and human trafficking. We all saw that technology was being used to facilitate trafficking, but we wanted to flip around the question and ask, how can technology be developed to actually combat trafficking as well? Thus started a deep dive into this space. And in that time, our center produced a comprehensive report. We've convened multi-sector meetings. We've engaged with numerous stakeholders at the federal, state, and local level to discuss problems and opportunity. But I wanted to talk about interdisciplinary, because one of the most fortuitous things which happened was actually meeting Ed Hovey. And how that happened was someone at ISI who doesn't even work in this space, Gordon Ressler, he works on smart grids, heard about my research and just thought that perhaps Ed's group, the Natural Language Programming Group, could help in some way. Thus, we started working together to explore how to build tools based on the assumption that while the sale of essentially human beings for sex and kids involve clandestine communication, the internet enables perpetrators to advertise across a greater distance to a wider audience. And through large-scale data analysis, we were intent on cracking the codes, actually, which indicated possible cases of child sex trafficking, thus providing real-time, actionable information to those who can help. Now, through this work, I am convinced that the issue of human trafficking and technology cannot be understood or addressed by any one discipline, not computer scientists alone, not social scientists, not legal folks. The thing is, the interdisciplinary work, while it's pretty fun, is really hard and really challenging stuff. As you know, finding common grounds across disciplines is not easy. For instance, believe it or not, there are real strengths to self-reports. There's strengths to interviews, and there's strengths to very small N observations. They help us understand underlying social processes. At the same respect, there are strengths and limitations to what we know about behavioral indicators from big data sets. So communicating, in our interdisciplinary work, communicating expectations is key. Computer scientists cannot expect social scientists, the social scientists in the room, to be an expert in statistics, anthropology, sociology, psychology, and economics all at the same time. Just like social scientists cannot expect the computer science in the room to be an expert in machine learning, database, semantic analysis, and know how to make a website that looks like Facebook and is mobile too. Simple role deliberation up front, where teams sort of invest time to discuss their roles, is actually key. How will each of us be involved in the research and in building the solutions? Because few social scientists are going to want to just do the lit review on human trafficking, and few computer scientists are just going to want to be scraping data from Backpage. But once we start working together using a mixed methods approach, we can address the specific socio-technical issues which we combined are well poised to address: data collection and data security, data mining and surveillance and privacy, false negatives, false positives, and online identity. But whatever our disciplinary challenges, they are compounded by the political minefield which marks the terrain of commercial sexual exploitation and the sex trafficking of minors. First of all, we're talking about children, sex, adults, money. Already, it's a highly charged political issue. Add in organized crime, race and ethnicity, gender, the legal system, health, poverty. You will find competing interests, competing missions, ideology, different perspectives, and emotions at every turn. And there's a lot at stake. I mean, at some times, there is a life and death of a child actually at stake. Hence the need for a deep understanding of the social dynamics which underlie the trafficking trade. We need to understand the behavioral indicators and the social actors involved. Now, social scientists are particularly well poised to understand the power relationships between these actors and also social behavior. So how to do this? Well, this involves listening. And if you start listening to people who have actually been working in this field for decades, you will start to notice that words and language really matter. The language used to describe human trafficking are politically laden with very strong political consequences. And let me just, because we talked a little bit about terms, let me just talk about the terms we use to describe some of these social actors. So here on the left side of the screen, you see terms we can use to describe sex workers, escorts, and prostitutes. Now, this grouping is sort of grouped under relative legitimacy of these quote-unquote professions. However, minors under the age of 18, I would argue these terms do not apply at all. Minors under federal law have no social agency to consent to engage in commercial sexual activity. Thus, alternative terms are trafficked person, victim, maybe even sex slave or survivor. Similarly, the terms that we use for client, John, and solicitor sort of signal some sort of transactional agreement in this commercial exchange. However, if you also use this sort of similar words like, or not similar, but different, exploiter, sex offender, child rapist, you will start to see that this reframes the whole behavior in terms of predatory activity and in terms of criminality. And just as one example, the Cook County State's Attorney General's Office in 2012 helped pass an act which removed all references of the term juvenile prostitute or prostitution from the criminal code. So what exactly do these what exactly do we, those who are developing innovations, really care about terminology which is supposed to sort of describe an objective social phenomena? Well, as non-experts entering into the trafficking field, there's a need to understand these nuances because we run the risk then of designing models and technologies which sort of embed these political aspects within those interventions themselves. Designing interfaces and technologies too fast could actually lead to unintended consequences. In fact, we seriously need to consider that the technologies that we might develop could be used in the wrong way and could possibly be harmful in some way. While we can't control all of how technology is going to be used, I think do no harm is probably a good creed for us to adopt. Harm to whom, you might ask? Well, that depends on your orientation. To some, reducing harm means protecting the identity of law enforcement, going undercover. To others, it's reducing false positives to protect the privacy rights of the user. In my report, we laid out some guiding principles for any technological intervention where we argue that the ultimate beneficiary should be the victims and survivors. Now, without this principle and this reflection on language, technologies we invent or develop, which are meant to protect and prevent, can also be used to prosecute people we might not want to prosecute. Yes, in many states, juveniles who are involved in this sort of are subjected to this crime are often sent to jail and to juvenile detention. Now, this is a very complex issue. Sometimes juvenile detention is the only place where these children can get the services that they need. Sometimes it's the only safe place to protect them from retribution from their exploiter, et cetera. But designing technologies with the assumption of that a child can be a prostitute, let's just say, and that they are criminals and they need to go to jail for punitive measures, I would argue is completely wrong-headed. And we need to understand that these are exploited victims who are traumatized victims of extreme physical and psychological abuse. Okay, so how am I doing on time? So we just need to be honest that there's going to be no simple technological fixes to this issue. But in order to create actionable data and collect actionable data to intervene, this begs the question about who can act on this data, actionable by whom? How can we test our hypotheses? How do we formulate proof of concept initiatives? How do we actually implement our solutions? And really one of the only ways to effectively implement is through partnerships. Partnerships, even though this is a very quaint kumbaya type visual here, The fact is, partnerships are extremely hard. Most of the folks that we need to partner with are people we don't really necessarily work with very often as evidence-based researchers. We're talking NGOs, law enforcement, faith-based groups, and others. So the challenge really is to get social scientists, researchers, and technologists sort of into the conversation with people who are actually doing real work in the field. And so a big question is how to incentivize collaboration. This is where Dana, Rain, and Digital Crimes Unit at Microsoft really come in. These grants that we've heard about and we'll hear about in other times have really provided the necessary structure for collaboration. And it's really just the beginning. I mean, when I released our report last year, there was so much attention and positive attention to it. It just sort of told me that this field is hungry and even desperate for the kind of research that we can actually provide. So they need us, they need our leadership in this area, and we actually need them to implement. And so when we do actually get the seat at the table, we're going to sort of notice a lot of different perspectives vying for attention. Victim-centered approaches, health-centered, legal-centered, et cetera. I would argue that our socio-technical perspective deserves a spot at the table and can contribute a lot to the discussion. And not that we have to be at the center of anything, but it's going to be involved in the network of response. Now, I don't expect all of you to suddenly take up human trafficking in your own research agendas. But as more and more of our social life, as Dana says, is becoming more visible via computer-mediated communication, social network sites, and mobile platforms, the secret is out that these interactions can potentially measure behavior, which are indicators of good or bad behavior. In reality, we're going to see more forms of abuses and exploitations arise on digital networks, and we're going to be faced with the increasingly public calls to do something about it and to innovate and find solutions. Thus, we have an opportunity to make a real contribution with our attention to data, information, language, social behavior, computation, analytics, and measured, careful research. Our disciplinarity is needed to build the socio-technical interventions that will ultimately help the victims and survivors of human trafficking and the multitude of human rights issues to come. Thank you.
So I've had the joy of letting you see a scatter shot of different research that's in the space of human trafficking. At this point, I want to actually open it up to questions so that we have time. I know you've gotten pummeled with different information, but if there are things that you're curious about or wanting to understand more, it would be great to hear from you guys. Yeah. Oh, actually, I think there's mics that have to go for recording.
Yes. Okay. Štěpánka Korytová from Indiana University. I think excellent presentations, and I really want to congratulate you on the papers. And what I'm going to say should not be meant as a criticism, but more as a sort of contribution to the debate. And you know, I have lots of comments here, but definitely I would say that technology did increase the human trafficking, and especially when you talk about sex exploitation, you know, the images that you can take on a phone during a certain activity and then use it as a threat and then subsequently maybe pimp the person, just comes to my mind. Also, I think the fact, you know, the technology hopefully will be used with a phenomenon, human trafficking, that is a problem that is unseen. That's why it's so difficult to deal with. So that's problematic. There's also problems with the data. You know, what methodology was used to arrive at certain data. That's why it's so difficult to make any estimations. And also, I think I want to suggest that while sex trafficking is certainly is sort of, we get morally upset about the idea of children being exploited sexually, but we should, I want to suggest that we should think about human trafficking, that this includes labor trafficking, organ trafficking. Kids have been and are used as sort of involuntary donors of, if it is kidneys, okay, but if it is other organs, I mean, I'm not saying it's okay, but at least the children can live. But very often they're used, the other organs are used, and that's the end. And lastly, I think I want to maybe suggest that technology should be not only used to combat trafficking, but also to make public aware of the problem, because I think there are still, I'm sure that all of you still are coming across people who say, human trafficking, does it still exist? So definitely to create awareness of the problem. And I have some other things, but the question, I think, I forgot about what question I was going to ask, but I think I just wanted to make these comments. So thank you.
Does anyone want to respond? Right here? I don't think it's on.
Oh, power switch. It's very complicated technology. So I'm John Kelsey from NIST. I know nothing about this, so I'm just going to ask a question that came up in some of the discussion you had. It struck me that the descriptions of cases you were talking about, the sort of defining thing about the role of technology in these cases was that it provided evidence that couldn't be intimidated away. It seems like, especially if you've got a criminal gang running prostitutes, it's not real healthy to testify against gang members, right? Especially if you have to go back and live in the neighborhood where they run things. And so it struck me that having this extra path of technology giving you evidence, giving you, okay, well, here are the cell phone records, here's the stuff on Facebook, that really probably takes some of the advantage away from physical violence, from the ability to threaten people or maybe emotionally appeal to people to say, hey, don't you really love me? Don't we love each other? You don't want to testify against me. So I'm wondering if I'm understanding that right, and if there's anything that if that's maybe I guess a silver lining for the role of technology here, that maybe it's easier to prosecute these crimes now.
You want to go?
If I could speak both in my current position as a law professor, but drawing on my experience as a prosecutor prior to that, where I learned to speak quickly. You're right, and make no mistake about it, the work that you all can do in helping generate this evidence is the difference between guilt and innocence, an acquittal or a conviction, and it's the difference between future victims not being trafficked because an offender was stopped. And that's exactly it. Think about the Sandusky case, if I could, by way of analogy. Everyone's upset by that, right? Everyone's upset by the occurrences. Look what it took to get a conviction. 7 grown adults, 2 eyewitnesses, and documented evidence. Well, then we're all really willing to convict there. Well, in a child sex trafficking case, we have similar issues, right? We have similar issues about a reluctance to accept that child sexual abuse took place, and the dynamic between the victim and the offender. We're learning so much more about that parallel to interpersonal violence, etc. That this kind of evidence can corroborate, which can make a victim's testimony more acceptable to a jury doing a very difficult task of finding something beyond a reasonable doubt. It can also encourage a victim who is less likely to go forward because she realizes or he realizes it's not just his testimony alone, as well as the protection pieces. And it can also allow cases to go forward when there's no victim at all. You can still go forward and build a case by this type of evidence. So it is critical. It is critical to these cases, and without them, offenders who are stopped by law enforcement will continue victimizing people.
Just one small comment to that. It was interesting to me that the FBI guys also want us to look at backgrounds of pictures at like hotel rooms, because they want to be able to, at the point when they apprehend a young person, say, look, we know you were in this hotel room last week because we saw that photo of you in that hotel room. And we know this, and we know this, and we know you're from Oklahoma originally, and so on. So just let you know, we're ready to help you here. And that's something that if they don't have access to all this information immediately right there, they couldn't do. But we saw in the time we were with them that by virtue of having a little bit of extra information, they were willing to get the young woman to actually work with them more than otherwise she was, because she was intimidated. As soon as she walks out there, she's in big trouble. And so, she denied the tattoo on her neck. This is my boyfriend's tattoo. Yeah, right? And they tattoo them. So it's actually quite interesting to hear about all the unexpected places where technology can help.
So one of the challenges to keep in mind in this is that a lot of times judges and prosecutors don't understand the data that they're dealing with. And so for many of you who are computer scientists in the room, to the degree that you're willing to actually do some training for law enforcement to understand, and for judges to do that, that's really important. And I will say that at Harvard's Berkman Center, there's a clinical professor by the name of Phil Malone who has actually taken on the job of training a lot of judges on how to deal with this. And so, for those of you who understand the data mining techniques, who understand, what kinds of evidence you're starting to see, the degree to which you're actually willing to prepare and talk to both judges and prosecutors, a lot can go forward with that. And that's another thing that you can do to be very helpful. Because these techniques that in the back of your head without thinking are not necessarily understood. So a lot of times prosecutors don't know what to do with that kinds of evidence, even if it's just sitting in front of them.
And well, I was going to add that things like, is my mic
You on? I don't think you're on.
Things like interface matter a lot to police, and police, whenever you're working with police, they have to be able to integrate any new software into what they're already doing. They're also concerned about things like training. It needs to be online, it needs to be in chunks, it needs to be something that's simple to acquire. They worry about things like upgrades. They need some consistent commitment to find usable tools, because there's a lot of turnover in police departments. So they're very busy. If something isn't actually useful and easy to use, even though the data may be wonderful, it's not going to end up being used by police. And I guess that's very similar, after talking to so many people here, it's very similar to the problems that you have just creating programs for everyday use. You have to know how people use it and actually actively work with police in developing something useful.
And another thing to realize is that police departments and investigators and agents are ridiculously overworked. And to simply have sort of data and giving it to them, saying, "No, this might be trafficking, and this might be trafficking. This is a possibility." We shouldn't do that.
So can I add on to really quickly? I would just underscore, as you think about technological developments you can do, thinking about making that information accessible, and just to both judges and prosecutors, but to parents and to potential bystanders, knowing that here's a tool that can be used. Or imagine if at the point of sale, when you go to buy a cell phone, and there's a lot of conversation about how they can connect my contacts and they can do all of this stuff. I would like a little conversation about how can I use the tools that are on there that you all have created, spend as much time on that. So if you make that information accessible to the public and to judges, and just as a scary point of reference, the average age of the Supreme Court justice, if you subtract the last two, because they messed up my math, is over 70. Okay? The last two, and the only two to really engage in the last technology case in any discussion of technology, bring us down into the 60s. But the people that are deciding this really have to understand your technology in order to make the right rulings in court. And you can help with that in ways that no one else can.
Okay. Hi, Eric Gilbert, Georgia Tech. This was a great panel. Thank you very much for putting it together. So I want to push on this idea of technologies that might be good here. So we heard a lot about technologies that build evidence for law enforcement. So my first question is, what other technologies do you think might be useful, and perhaps even in different application domains? The second, and this is just me trying to understand the problem better, so let's say there was some magical technology that could totally disrupt this market and make it not viable to advertise, right? Would that be a good thing? And what would happen? And two, would it be a good thing?
I'll start with your second question and my opinions on it. I think disruption is actually really, by the way, there's another question here. I think that disruption is a really important thing. I think disruption and destabilizing these systems is extremely important. Now that said, I don't think that it solves it. And I think that one of the things that we don't go into on this puzzle is that actually identifying a young person who's been victimized is just the beginning of a long process. So not only in the States are they likely to be prosecuted if they're identified in many states. But the thing is that there's very little to no recovery processes. There's no integration processes, et cetera. So part of it is this challenge about how you're dealing with a complex system puzzle. Now, what I think technology can bring to it is disruption. I think it can make it more risky to actually engage in these acts. And I think that's a balancing challenge for all of us. So for example, you want it to be really scary if you're trying to buy sex. You want it to be scary that you don't know if you're dealing with a cop or if you're dealing with an individual. Now, will that make it go away? No. We will always see some cat and mouse to this. But the idea is the more disruption that we can do and the more services that we can provide, hopefully we can make a difference. I don't know if other...
Well, I was going to say, I think the real issue in disruption is it going to increase danger to victims. Mm-hmm. And I think certainly there are ways to handle that question, to take that into account. But I think at least that's the big area of concern I see. And also, I am a skeptic about how much technology has impacted all of this. I think in terms of law enforcement, it has made law enforcement much, much stronger. I have never seen data that has shown technology has increased or even really changed the dynamics of any sort of crime that involves child sexual abuse or child molestation or any sort of child victimization. But I think the overall point is that we have managed to see declines in child sexual abuse with attacks from a lot of different points. And so I think all of these sorts of aids can come together so that we can see declines, although we're talking about an area that is much harder to measure than other types of sexual abuse.
And just quickly, to your first question, without giving a bunch of examples, I would just say if you just shift the orientation from a legal-centered approach and law and punitive or evidentiary or investigatory approach to a health-centered one, or how victims could possibly use technology or any other variety, you could start to sort of think about other ways technology can be used.
There have been discussions along those lines, but you run into the privacy issue here, right? So if you can harvest a bunch of people's postings on, say, Facebook about themselves, and you get the characteristics of a depressed teenager who's ready to run away and is finding out, how do I get to Hollywood, if you can then intervene right there and say, don't run to Hollywood, talk to this person or something, call this number, that's one way to help. Another thing, if you can go and find on the John boards discussions and you see this guy is going to do something that you find out something about this person and his history and where he's been to Thailand and all this stuff, and you create a record of knowledge over months or years of what this person has posted under different pseudonyms and things, but you're pretty sure it's the same guy. At some point, you can put some posting up that leads him to a honeypot place where when he gets there, it says, hello, I know you, you were here then, and then, I know all about you, scare the shit out of the guy, and then they stop. That sort of thing can be done, is being discussed about, So there's all kinds of other things you can think of if you're clever about how you can combat this problem.
If I can echo that point, I think that when we think about technology and disruption, there's disruption in all different actors. And one of the things I think the public policy is really focusing on is demand. And that's why we're seeing more and more laws focusing on making it a clear crime to purchase a child and decreasing the crime to be a quote-unquote child prostitute, which is following some of the European models. It's not perfect, but it's one of the things. The other thing I would say is one thing that technology has done is it has moved our witnesses. I mean, colloquially, people are talking about how this has moved from the red light district to some degree to cyberspace. As Dana pointed out in the beginning, you can still find it plenty on the streets. But that changes our witness potential from cab drivers and medical people who are trained, hopefully now, to recognize these kinds of victims. Now we have to train the people in cyberspace so they can see that ad and they can recognize. So another area that technology can be used is in prevention. How can not preventing the victim from perhaps following a path that isn't wise, but the bystanders recognizing dangers and being able to immediately report, draw attention, those sorts of things as well. It's another aspect to think about.
Okay. I have a question, and I'm probably very naive about some of this, but what is the, for the children, what is the target base that these perpetrators are doing on the victims? I mean, is there a certain age or a group or that you're seeing, or is it all across lines? I guess when I saw that, you know, I looked at you saying Maryland and what have you in the U.S., and I'm like, really? So I don't know anything about it, so that's what I'm asking. Is it across all lines, or is it a specific, you know, group or age or what have you that this is happening with?
I'd say we actually know quite a bit about the victims of prostitution. We know a lot about child sexual abuse. We know a lot about sexual offenders. Child prostitution is largely targeted at adolescents. Most of those kids come from very difficult backgrounds. Many of them have run away from home. Kids that are solicited by pimps are often very emotionally needy, and a lot of the trauma that they go through when they're being prostituted often increases their trauma, so you often have kids who have huge physical health problems and a lot of emotional and mental health problems also, and you have kids who tend to be very suspicious of authority, who often are allied with their abusers. Now, there's still a lot of diversity in that group. So there certainly are cases of kids who are abducted into prostitution. Kids are desperately trying to escape. And I think a focus on technology that might help those kids is also, would be a real boon, I don't know if that answered your question enough, but.
We'll make sure there's a couple of, actually at this point I think I'm going to ask for a couple of questions and then have a final response. Is that cool?
Is this on? Okay. First off, I wanted to thank Mark for bringing up young men that are being prostituted. That's an area that nobody wants to deal with, and I appreciate that you brought that up. My name's Sue McIntyre, and I'm from Mount Royal University, but I'm a private practitioner, consultant, researcher in this area. I'm really curious, Mary, what you said about the changes. Maybe I've got the wrong person. I'm sorry. The woman from Jennifer. That's sorry. I'm looking for names. Yeah. I'm really curious what you talked about, a decrease in running away. My view, and it kind of tied in a little bit to what Mark also said, is that police are very busy. I can tell you in my country, running away is not something that's considered highly serious. It's not something that gets reported immediately. It's kind of one of those things that kids do. And it takes a fair bit till something's going to get reported. So I would, in my country, would challenge that. The other part from our end.
Well, I was just going to say, in the United States, there's a congressionally funded study, or mandated study, called the National Incident Study of Missing, Abducted, Runaway, and Thrown Away Children. We are in the middle of doing this third survey right now. My office is doing the part of the runaway section, so we'll have final data. It probably won't be for another year and a half or so, but we expect to see declines in running away, not just the police report data that I put up there. But I feel pretty solid in stating that there have been declines since the early 1990s in running away in the U.S.
Well, I'll be interested to see that. The other comment was, I would think that we have a number of youth that are throwaways, that are homeless, and that people aren't even counting, and that we've kind of taken this group of kids that could have been runaways, but now they're throwaways, and they're just in this whole kind of mix of the whole formula. And I don't know what your numbers look like at a national level around the age of homeless youth and where they fall into that. So.
Sadly, I'm going to have to cut this off because I know that there's another panel immediately there. Before I do, I want to actually ask everybody who is here as part of one of the human trafficking researchers to stand up. There are a group of researchers here that are doing different work on human trafficking. For those of you who are interested in, please approach us for the rest of today. Please engage us about with your different questions. We would love to talk with you more about the different kinds of things that are going on. And I would say thank you to the panel, and thank you for all of your good questions and engagement.